lesson on how to annotate or mark a short story. This will be very valuable to your reading because it will help you understand the story as you are reading it and have a fuller understanding for discussion in class. The first thing that we are going to do is look at the title of the story. Titles are very valuable to a story. Many times they carry important details that we don't think about until after the story is done. The title of the story is A Worn Path. The story is by Eudora Welty. The first thing I think about with this title is the term path. That's my noun. And I think to myself, she could have used road, trail, street. There are many terms that essentially are the same thing, a route we walk on. But she says path. So to me, that gives me a rural feel. The second thing I'm going to look at is the word worn and the way she describes path. Worn means that it's been used many times. So I have to ask myself if the path that's being spoken about has been used many times. Now let's start by reading the story. And as we go through the parts of the story, we will do the same type of thing where we will write our notes in the margins or along it. Don't be afraid to underline, make marks, or put question marks even when you don't understand, so that you can come back to class with specific questions. It was December, a bright frozen day in the early morning. Well, that makes it very easy for us. December gives us the date. We know it's the last month of the year. A bright frozen day, so we can assume that it's cold, but sunny in the early morning. So now we have a time, so it's in the AM. So just in that simple sentence, we've been told quite a bit of information already about the setting. Far out in the country, there was an old Negro woman with her head tied red rag. We'll stop there. One of the first things that strikes me is the use of the word Negro. It's not a term that we commonly use anymore. In fact, it's become a term in our common language that would be considered almost offensive. So this tells me that the story is set in a time much earlier than modern day. So I'm going to put past and then old term. Head tied red rag. She has a scarf on her head. So we're starting to get an idea of what this person starts to look like. Coming along a path through the pine woods. Well, the pine woods is an interesting thing for me because it's starting to give me an idea of where the story might be taking place. So it's an area with pines. Now, you might not think that's very significant, but certain areas of the country are going to be more heavily pine forested than Wisconsin, for example. Her name was Phoenix Jackson. The narrator gives us the name here, Phoenix Jackson. Now, the first thing you might think of when you think of Phoenix is the city in Arizona. For me, I think of the rising phoenix. Think more Harry Potter, the bird that goes up in flame in order to be reborn. Will that become significant later? Might be. So let's put a question mark by that to see if that's a question we'll want to ask. She was very old and small, and she walked slowly in the dark pine shadows, moving a little from side to side in her steps with the balanced heaviness and lightness of a pendulum in a grandfather clock. We have some great detail here, old and small. So now we know much more about Phoenix Jackson. We know her size. We know generally an age. And she walked slowly. So I might ask myself with this, does she have trouble walking? In the dark pine shadows. So it's dark. This starts to lead me into some of the tone of the story. I mean, she said bright, frozen day here, but we have dark pine shadows. So that's an important thing. Moving a little from side to side with their steps, with balanced heaviness and lightness of a pendulum. So that heaviness and lightness give us movement. Like that pendulum, right? It's a nice image. In a grandfather clock. Now, this is another age-related term. Many of you know grandfather clocks or grandmother clocks. So the grandfather and her oldness is interesting that they describe her movement like a grandfather clock. She carried a thin, small cane, so we have to ask ourselves, made from an umbrella, is she hurt? or disabled perhaps? Is this age that is causing her to need a cane? And with this, she kept tapping the frozen earth in front of her. Okay, so we have an emphasis here on the frozen. I'm going to say repeat it. It's important that they repeat that detail. This made a grave and persistent noise in the still air. I like the word grave because we have grave where someone would be buried, and grave and persistent as a way to describe the noise of her tapping. Very serious is what they're using here. But you see how that grave or cemetery image starts again to add to the tone here. She's not skipping bright and sunny through the trees. She's walking, tapping on that frozen ground. So you see a lot of death imagery or absence of life, frozen, frozen again, grave, and then when we keep going, still, that no movement, that seemed meditative, like the chirping of a solitary means alone, little bird. This is the first image other than the pine woods, and that's dark pine shadows. The bird is the first real living image that we have, but it's a solitary little bird. So we really get the image that Phoenix is all alone. The narrator wants us to feel her aloneness, her solitary isolation. Now let's look at the second paragraph. She wore a dark striped dress reaching down to her shoe tops. Again, we're getting some nice image, but again, it's dark. Notice the emphasis. She wore a dark striped dress reaching down to her shoe tops. She has shoes on, so she's dressed for the cold. And I can put a question mark there if I'm not sure, if I'm making guesses. And an equally long apron of bleached sugar sacks. The second part of the sentence, and an equally long apron of bleached sugar sacks, says something perhaps about her economic status. Doesn't necessarily mean that she's terribly poor, but she might be considered thrifty, or where she would need to reuse sugar sacks in order to make them into an apron, as opposed to buying an apron or making it out of cotton or material she may have purchased. With a full pocket. Now the full pocket, we have to ask ourselves, is something in the pocket that makes it full? Or is it the size of the pocket? If we go back to the idea that the story was written some time ago, this would be another example of where we can definitely see that it takes place in a prior time where perhaps people needed to be more thrifty in the reuse of items. So you would have bought sugar in an actual cloth sack, and then you could have reused it to make clothing. And in the Depression, for example, many people did that with flour sacks, sugar sacks. They were made of cloth, and people reused them and actually made clothing and wore them. And the full pocket would have been very handy for a lady in the kitchen who would have needed to put things in as she was carrying and cooking and all of the activities she completed. All neat and tidy. So this is another interesting thing. She's neat and tidy. So she's clean, and she's well put together. So she's not somebody who's let herself go. She certainly seems to be somebody who, even though she's old and she's making this walk, she certainly seems like a together person. But every time she took a step, she might have fallen over her shoelaces, which dragged from her unlaced shoes. All right, I might have to take back what I just said about the neat and tidy. Why are her shoelaces unlaced? Now we can make some guesses about that. Being elderly, is it, does she have like arthritis? Maybe her fingers don't work? Does she have trouble bending over? She's carrying a cane. She has kind of a side-to-side step. So something's going on that's preventing her from keeping her shoes tight, because every other description the narrator uses, she's a pretty put-together person. She looked straight ahead. The comments of straight is a nice term here because she's got a purpose, right? She knows where she's going. She's going to keep moving. Her eyes were blue with age. This reference of blue is most likely to the fact that she has cataracts, and so her eyes have a bit of a haze to them, and she probably would have very limited sight In modern day today, we can easily do this surgery for elderly people. It's a very common surgery for those who are elderly to help them because their cataracts of their eyes are just getting so old. So that's where the blueness comes from. Her skin had a pattern all of its own of numberless branching wrinkles, and as though a whole little tree stood in the middle of her forehead. Okay, this is a nice image. When we compare the wrinkles to the little tree here, we have what we call a metaphor. And it's a great way for Welty to give us a true image of just how wrinkly she is. And to show that age and reinforce the age when she's, constantly saying things like she's old. But a golden color ran underneath, and the two knobs of her cheeks were illumined by a yellow burning under the dark. This is an interesting thing. Golden and yellow burning. We may commonly want to think of pink or red or rosy, but for her, because her skin tone is probably darker, that golden or yellow is actually that idea of health or vitality yet. I'm going to put vitality over here. So that's a positive thing. And if you have to, put a nice little plus next to it to see that it's a positive tone. She's being described positively by the narrator, not negatively. And the two knobs of her cheeks were illumined by yellow burning under the dark. Under the red rag, her hair came down on her neck in the frailest of ringlets, still black and with an odor like copper. So we have the ringlets. It's another nice image, still black. So despite her age, she's not gray, which is kind of interesting. And the odor of like copper. Copper is yet another color that goes in with this golden, this yellow, and this redness. It's an interesting description though because it's a smell like copper, not the color like copper, but you can see how it ties nicely with those three. Okay, last paragraph we're going to do together, and then I'm going to turn you on to this all by yourself. Now and then there was a quivering in the thicket. Old Phoenix said, "Out of my way, all you foxes, owls, beetles, jackrabbits, coons, and wild animals. Keep out from under these feet, little bob whites. Keep the big wild hogs out of my path. Don't let none of those come running in my direction. I got a long way." Now we have our first piece of dialogue. So let's write that this is dialogue. We have a nice long list of words here describing the different animals that she might come in contact with. If you're not familiar with them, probably bob whites you might not be familiar with. That's a bird. Lives on the ground much like a pheasant or quail would. The big wild hogs will probably be the dangerous ones. Out of all of these, the others would probably go running the other direction if they saw her coming. Don't let none of those come running my way. We have a double negative here. So we're starting to look at the language that Phoenix uses and what that might say about her. That can help give us some more clues about where the story might be taking place. I've got a long way. So we have another little grammar issue here. Now that comes into what we call diction, is how language is used, the words we use. Under her small black freckled hand, her cane, limber as a buggy whip, would switch at the brush as if to rouse up any hiding things. So we have a buggy whip, another term that helps lead us back to the past, because typically most of us are not using buggy whips because we drive cars. So this is another reference to the past. Would switch at the brush. This is another term that we wouldn't commonly use in the modern day, as if to rouse up any hiding things. We'll just say an old term. And the rousing up hiding things. What could be in the brush? So this is where we might be asking ourselves questions like, what could be in the brush? Does she go this way often? If we assume that she's the main character and that title is referencing her, a worn path, we can probably consider that she's gone this way many times. Now we've gone through the first 3 paragraphs of the story. Your job is to continue on through the remaining part of the story and make your notes. I will be checking for those in class tomorrow, and then we will discuss them within our groups. If you have any questions, make sure you come to class ready to go with them. Thank you.